Hello and welcome to another PenPrig video. I'd like to introduce you to Michèle Bartlett. She is an advocate for neuroscience research. She's a psychotherapist who says that her everyday work is also concerned with the mystery of what goes on inside people's heads. Diagnosed with Parkinson's almost 6 years ago, she's been active in Parkinson's research from the beginning, both as a participant and in the wider PPIE capacity. She's the Deputy Chair of the EJS ACT-PD PPI Working Group and was recently appointed to CPP Advisory Council for Parkinson's endpoints. Over to you, Michèle.
Thank you, Sue. So good afternoon, everyone. I want to talk today about the power of research as a collaborative process and why we as people living with Parkinson's should be involved in the research process. So this is adapted from the Health Research Authority guidelines on people-centered clinical research. And it's hot off the press because it was actually updated yesterday. And the HRA have become very interested in making sure that patients are involved in clinical research as partners. And they've updated the guidance with some principles that they think are really important, such as great communication that underpins everything, that the research should be meaningful, accessible, open, and conducted in partnership. So the question is, why does that matter? Why are the Health Research Authority, and for that matter in the United States, the FDA, very interested in engaging patients in collaborative research? Well, it matters because research needs to be with and for the people it serves. We're the people living with this condition, and we know what is important to us. Research fails if it only provides answers for a particular group or types of person. It's typical that the sort of people that get involved in research are often from quite a specific selection of a population, say the Parkinson's population, and it tends to be always the same types of groups. But that means that if we run a study and it says XYZ about people with Parkinson's, it's only talking about some people with Parkinson's, and it might not apply to everybody. And so actually we're not doing the best research we can. It's really important that research that is conducted is relevant to people. It needs to address the concerns of people living with a condition. It needs to be asking the questions that they want answered, which might not be necessarily what the clinicians and researchers might be. It might not be the same thing. The research fails if it doesn't provide the right sort of answers. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to be available to all sorts of people. People that don't even know about research don't think it's for them. It needs to get perspectives from a wide range of people. A lot of research has very stringent criteria for recruiting people. And actually, if it's more inclusive, we get wider answers. And it needs to be meaningful. There's not much point finding out that something does something really, what the researchers think is really interesting and important, if it's not meaningful to the everyday lives of people living with Parkinson's. Because we may not be interested in whether that means that we can walk up and down a corridor faster. We might be more interested in knowing whether it affects our functional ability to carry out the things we want to do in our everyday lives. Those are the meaningful things to us and our care partners. So therefore, we need to make sure that research questions address the things that we want to know the answers for. And it needs to be respectful. It needs to take account of our views. We need to have our views heard and listened to and given equal weighting so that we're equal partners. And by doing that, that helps us to make better research decisions, choosing more appropriate types of research, maybe better methods and more interesting and meaningful and relevant outcomes, which is why I've got a picture of mission control here, because we should be sitting in mission control with the researchers and guiding the mission. It's really important that we're part of running where the mission's going. We're not just add-ons. I think this is really a really important thing. Patient public involvement and engagement used to be a bit, sometimes I think in some studies, a bit tokenistic in terms of, having a couple of people and then they could tick a box. But I feel like now there's a real push to really include people in research decisions. So why have I got a picture of a rocket? Well, running trials I always say, is a bit like building rockets and launching them into space. It takes about 5 years to build a rocket, and it costs an awful lot of money. And the apparatus you need to launch the thing into space tends to drop off, which means that the next time you want to launch the rocket, you have to build it all again and spend the money all over again. And clinical trials tend to be a little bit like that. They take forever. They seem to take forever if you're a person waiting for the results to set up. They cost a lot, and often we have to start again from scratch. So there are lots of ways that people are thinking about how this can be done more efficiently, and the mission, if you like, that can get the answers more quickly. And it's really important. So what do we mean by research involvement? Well, you don't have to be on a space mission. You don't have to be on a clinical trial. There are very many ways of being involved in research and giving the views of people living with Parkinson's, starting with things like plain English summaries. When people are trying to write a funding application for a new piece of research, they have to produce a plain English summary. And often, if you've ever worked on one, they're not very plain English. They're often very complex. So it really helps to have people living with a condition helping the researchers to put those sorts of things into lay language. Same thing with grant applications. Very helpful to have a person with Parkinson's or care partner talking to the researchers about, what would make their grant application better? What are the things that are important to us? How can they have the perspective of people living with this condition into the grant application? It's really useful to get involved in focus groups. Sometimes researchers have questions on specific things, like, say, an exercise intervention, and they'd like to run a focus group to see what people think about that. Before they start setting up a bigger study, they might run a small focus group. That can be a very interesting thing to do, and quite low key, and often they're done on Zoom, or even taking part in surveys that many people sort of distribute surveys to a number of people. You often see them on social media, actually, if you're linked up to Parkinson's research in different ways, that it's researchers want to start with a survey to see what the general view is, consensus view on certain aspects of whether people, try different dietary approaches, whether they're trying different exercise interventions. They're not always even about clinical trials. And also, it's really useful for people living with the condition to be involved in study design. We can help researchers to design really appropriate studies, like maybe think about how people could get involved without having to travel to assessment centres and clinics. Think about how you could help to set up studies which mean that you can access them remotely via Zoom, and be assessed remotely. Or maybe think about questions like, how long should a study be? Would people sign up if it's 2 years, 3 years, 5 years? Those sorts of questions are really important to researchers, and practical considerations like, how do we make it accessible for people to get there if they have to get there? What sort of procedures would they be prepared to undertake? Some people might not want to have to come to assessments in an off medication state. They might not want to have the lumbar puncture, and all of those questions we can help, to give a view on what's the overview, what do people living with Parkinson's think about that. So we can help the researchers design better studies. And there are observational studies, often quite long-term very interesting observational studies like the Oxford Discovery Cohort, and the Michael J. Fox Foundation runs the PPMI study, which is collecting lots and lots of data from many people living with Parkinson's over a number of years. And that sort of becomes a big database, like a biobank of really interesting data that researchers can use. They're really important. You can sign up to an observational study and maybe only have to go in every couple of years to give either some data or blood samples or that type of thing. Very, very useful. And of course, we have things like randomized controlled trials trying to determine whether new drug treatments could help to stop or slow progression of Parkinson's. For that, we need a double-blinded trial, which means a placebo arm and usually one other arm with an active drug, and nobody knows who's taking what, so it's fair. And it's, that's a really good way of finding out whether something works or doesn't work. But as I said before, with the rocket, we need to speed that process up because it takes a really long time. If you are in a trial, you can feel a bit like this. You can feel like the scientists are on the mission, they're collecting data. You feel a bit out of touch with everybody. The comms are a bit patchy. And what we want to do by giving feedback to researchers is help to make trials very participant friendly, to help recruit people to trials, keep them on trials, make them work well, make them operate faster. One of the questions is, what do we bring to research? Well, we bring a sense of urgency, I hope, from the PD community, saying, hurry up, we need answers quickly. We bring the awareness of practical issues. We bring insights on communication, how to keep things simple for people. Don't make it all really complicated language. Don't ask them to do really complicated things. How to connect with people with Parkinson's who maybe don't know much about research and typically are not easy to reach. Maybe there's different ways of trying to connect with people who aren't involved in research at the moment and might have some really interesting different perspectives to offer. And we can help with that. People with Parkinson's who are involved in research can help researchers to think about how to make those connections, how to make trial information as simple as possible. Trials typically have a patient information sheet, which is to help anybody signing up understand what they're signing up to so that they can give informed consent. And I call it sometimes ill-informed consent, but sometimes they're about 12 to 16 pages long, those patient information sheets, and the language is very complex. And of course, they have to include a lot of things from the ethical point of view. But my perspective on that is that we should find a way to condense some of that information into a much simplified form, maybe like an infographic or a video format, to help people understand better what they're signing up to, and make it far less daunting. And all of those things are things that we can also help with by giving that kind of feedback to researchers. That if somebody hands you a 12-page document, you might feel really overwhelmed. And we can think about meaningful outcomes. As I said before, if you're designing a trial and you're measuring whether it works or not, it's important to measure whether it works or not in terms of what people living with Parkinson's feel about that. Is it going to make a difference to their quality of life if this drug or this intervention that you're trialing works or doesn't? I believe that outcome measures on trials should always involve a patient-reported element, patient and care partners, not just the view of a clinician. And also, how can we better measure how, with a fluctuating condition that changes not just from day to day, but within a day? How do we measure? If you go to a clinic, we're just getting a snapshot. So one of the things that we can help researchers think about is, how do you measure these things better? Digital technology now is beginning to offer us ways to have continuous data capture by people having wearables. And that means that you're actually getting a much better real-time view of how their condition changes, and maybe whether whatever intervention you're trying is making a difference because you're actually measuring it in that way. and that data is more objective. And in terms of developments and innovations, we're getting some really interesting novel biomarkers now coming through. So, for example, seed amplification assay, which is taking people's cerebrospinal fluid via a lumbar puncture, and then in the lab growing that to see whether it includes alpha-synuclein. So that helps the researchers to identify, and that's a diagnostic tool for whether that person has Parkinson's or Parkinsonism. And that's, you know, in a fairly early stage. This is quite a new development, but perhaps seed amplification assay could be used to test with the progression of the disease, and perhaps researchers will be able to find ways to grow to develop that technology so that it doesn't have to be from a lumbar puncture. You know, they're looking at doing that from saliva or skin samples, which means that more people might be prepared to give it a try. But I think there are lots of questions that, again, we can help with around that. If somebody's determining whether you've got alpha-synuclein in the sample you've given, would you want to know? And if you do want to know, what are the implications for you as a person living with Parkinson's? And what are the implications for knowing about your genetic profiling? I think these are all really complex ethical questions that, again, I think we need to be involved in helping researchers to think about. As these new technologies and innovations come online, it's tremendously exciting in a way, but it throws up all sorts of new challenges for the whole community, researchers and for patients. And finally, I mentioned before about the idea of accelerating clinical trials, because we don't want to keep building the rockets every time, taking so long. So there are new developments like multi-arm, multi-stage platform trials, like the Edmund J. Safra ACT-PD trial, accelerating clinical trials in Parkinson's disease, which is aiming to test one placebo arm against maybe 3 or 4 different parallel different interventions, different drugs, so that ideally we'll find answers faster. And I'm part of that consortium, which at the moment is about 90 people, including clinicians and researchers and biomedical statisticians, and around 12 patients and care partners, which is a quite significant proportion in that sort of consortium, who are really genuinely embedded in that project and in really having their views heard. So, you know, there is progress on this type of thing, and I believe that there's information about the ACT-PD consortium in the PEMPRIG library, if anyone's interested in finding out more about that, how that all works. Basically, I think we just want to go faster. You know, we want to go like a rocket booster, because we need answers on research, and we want it as soon as possible. We want to find some really good, better interventions for Parkinson's patients and their families. And if you sign up to research, you can be part of that process. Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Michèle. I'm amazed at the amount you're involved with, and I know I've not got the energy to do that. You've got the insight and the energy, and I wish you well. And I hope to see those rockets being built quicker and cheaper in the future. Thank you very much for the talk. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.